If you will, mentally, we're going to do a little dirty work here. There's a lot going on in this text, and a lot of it is kind of strange. So we're going to dig into the text a little bit. I'm going to do a first thing about preaching. Then we're going to dig into the text. Then we're going to get to Peter and our overarching Lenten thing. How is it that we are figuring out faith with Peter, through Peter? How is Peter a lens to our own journey following in the way of Jesus? First, I want to say a word, particularly on this day, as we get ready to hear this text about forgiveness without end, about one of the struggles of preaching. Preaching is a broadcast moment. So, 700 of you, or 143, of you are riveted or watching your phone while you have to listen to your father on the words that I'm saying. And I am saying words to all of the different places that you find yourself in. I want to name that because it isn't rare for me to have someone say something to me like, well, Andrew, that really didn't speak to me. And I'll be like, it can't all speak to you. We're all in different places, and this is a broadcast moment. I also want to name that particularly this day because if you are an individual who has experienced traumatic harm at the hands of someone else, do not hear me tell you that you have to go forgive them after worship today. The journey of forgiveness is personal and corporate, but very unique to the particular situations of harm. And because I believe deeply that forgiveness is about harm reduction, I have to name at the outset that forcing someone to forgive a traumatic abuser is abuse. And the church, as an institution, has failed in that way at times. It doesn't mean that forgiveness can never be a part of their journey. It means this is not a therapy session. I am not a professional licensed therapist, and in issues of deep traumatic harm, it's more complicated than what we're going to do here. Does that make sense to everyone? You're on board with me. At least nod. Even if you were less than riveted. Okay, I want to get that stated because we probably can't say that enough, right? That what we're talking here is generally true, but not necessarily specifically true. And what we are talking here about is about the wisdom of our inherited texts, but those texts are themselves broadcast messages that can't speak perfectly to every moment in time. That's why we interpret them together. And that's why two or more gather to that interpretive work. Now, this text has things that you hear and know. Two or more are gathered. Yeah, I hear that all the time, right? So that's in the middle of this text. The forgive more than 7 times. Oh yeah, most of us who even sort of relate to the church, we know that's a thing that gets said somewhere. We know all about the weirdness of binding and loosing in heaven and on earth. So it's amazing to realize these 3 pretty major concepts about how to be Christian community together are jammed into 7 verses that sometimes do weird things no one really knows. So I want to walk a little bit through what we're actually presented before we start trying to figure out what to do with that. So we have this teaching. Jesus is teaching generally. Remember, I've called you 12 to begin to form the kind of beloved community God yearns for the world to be. And when we went to the lost sheep of Israel, we found them having hardness of heart to that idea. So Jesus calls people who were mostly rejected by that idea. fishermen, tax collectors, prostitutes, people of subjective moral goodness. Jesus calls those people into something new, a new trial of beloved community. And so throughout the Gospels, he's trying to reveal what is the character of that community. And we replicate that journey because we try to do it here where theoretically we like and trust most of the people in the room. And we use this as the training ground to take that into our lives, where it is admittedly a lot harder. And Jesus is training about this, and he talks along the way as we move into this portion of Matthew about reclaiming lost sheep, of finding those who the world has left, ignored, and abandoned, of bringing them, of the beloved community, wrapping its arms around those who do not have community. That's important context, because then he says, when something happens within the beloved community, when something happens within the community that is the church, you've got to deal with it. I call this life is messy. Church is messy. Family is messy. Amen? I was at a pastor gathering a little bit ago, and about the third personal sharing of pastors, someone talked about doing a funeral in which one of the siblings was like, well, I'm off to a pre-planned trip. You can have mom's service without me. And then he looked at us and goes, maybe family wasn't God's best idea. Sometimes we feel that way. There's a messiness to the reality of what we're doing here. When you want to be beloved community, but you bring all your individual personality to bear, some of us are hard to bear. And so it's not surprising that Jesus begins to say, rifts are going to happen. People are going to say something you didn't like. People are going to ask a thing you didn't like. People are going to behave in ways you don't like. The front end of the text tells us, and when that behavior creates harm, echoes of harm, we might call it sin, fractures in the relationship between God and between us, you have to confront it. Which is something white Anglo-Saxon Protestants don't do. We have big rugs that we sweep all the stuff under. What's the shape of the rug in your living room? Is it like a landfill pit with gas vents? And Jesus is saying that's not authentic, beloved community. When ruptures in relationship happen, you've got to confront each other. You've got to go to someone and say, I need to tell you that when you made that joke, it wasn't funny. It hurt. We were talking at First Light about the times people might apologize, and we say, no big deal. And one of the person said, I had a person tell me, no, it was a big deal. Don't toss it off. I did something wrong. And I don't want it to get treated like it was no big deal. Which is how our society treats us to be. Oh, no biggie, no problem, it's okay. Just toss it off. Rather than really engage, you're right, that actually hurt. When the person shared that, I was like, oh, that's me every time I mess up someone's name. Which I do to you all the time, I'm sorry. Because I really want to name you correctly, and then I'll forget a name, or I'll just go to a whole weird space in my head, or I'll mispronounce the name, and folk will be like, oh, it's okay. No, it's not. It's not. When things happen, when we deny the personhood of our neighbor, when we don't name someone in the way they want to be named, when we talk out of turn about someone to someone else, these are ruptures in our community. They echo, they ripple out in ways that harm the ability of the community to be beloved and foster the belovedness of each other. And Jesus is saying, you gotta root that out. In healthy systems theory, we call this developing an immune system. You know, like the white blood cells that go to that kind of toxic behavior and stop it. Because when we tacitly accept it, it just grows. It becomes a part of the place. I have done conversations on forgiveness, and sooner or later, every conversation of forgiveness, when you open up a place of authenticity, comes down to how many people in the room were harmed by toxic community in churches. Particularly, Jesus is telling the church, you have to call each other out when you are behaving poorly. And there's a way to do that. Not necessarily from here. Broadcast messaging, very abusive place. You don't do it from there. You pull them aside and you say, hey, this is kind of how I felt when you did this thing. And if they don't hear you, great if they just hear you there, but I mean, you all have lived in the real world. If that doesn't work, now there's a lack of nuance here in the text. If that doesn't work, and it's real, you want to keep going. There's a different thing sometimes when we think we've been harmed and we haven't really. So not every time we don't get a hearing does it mean that we're in the right still and they're in the wrong still. So we're going to bring some other people into this listening, right? One of the things about our eyes, among other things, they're predators' eyes because they look forward, is that we can't see ourselves. We don't see the way we're behaving. I count on you to reflect to me how I am in the world. And so I might take some witnesses to say, okay, let's find out what's really going on. We think the text is giving us license to grab a couple of our closest friends to now go really hit them hard with how they're harmful. But I like to think of this as more, we're bringing in discerning listeners to hear the truths at play in this fractured relationship, to make sure we're both hearing and seeing more completely than our hurt will let us. And Jesus says, if that doesn't work, then he tosses off. Then do it within the whole community. Spends no time on that. We should spend little time on that. That's the way I get that from, because we have to be very careful before we make things about public shame. And that's where I think it's beautiful that we get to the third of this text. But I have to pause because I'm going to go chronologically and do this middle section first. We get this weird thing then. Jesus says what? If they don't listen to the whole congregation, what do we do then? You know me, I'm not rhetorical. What? Act like they're a Gentile or a tax collector. You should like this part. This is the part where we get to excommunicate people. Right? I mean, get me wrong, this is where the text gets really confusing. Because in any other person's mouth, what this means is excommunication. And in the interpretation of the church that came into being, that's how it's been understood. After acts of repair, private and small and public, if they're still not listening, we get to excommunicate them. The problem I have is that these words come out of the mouth of Jesus, for whom Gentiles and tax collectors are a recruitment zone of the new beloved community. I don't know what Jesus meant about that. Is this more Matthew and therefore should be heard as more excommunicating? Is this more Jesus and therefore should be heard more as now make them the focus of your reparative ministry? I don't know. I can't answer that tension for you except to say that for 2,000 years that tension has sat there in this text. And the text is going to add more tension to the mix. Because then Jesus goes on and says, whatever you do here, God's doing up there. And whatever you do together, I'm a part of it. And again, we can hear that in abusive ways that make us really important and turn God into kind of a schizophrenic God. Because there are a lot of gatherings of two who are asking contra things about each other in God's name, and I'm pretty sure God's not doing all of them. I think, as we talked about a couple weeks ago when we had one of these other texts, I think what it means is remember that the echoes of what you do in beloved community have eternal continuance. What you do here echoes into eternity. So hold that responsibly. Use that carefully. Be humble about the executing of communal power. And then Jesus, we think the text just kind of ends. The bell rings, the class wakes up, the sermon is over. No, it's not quite, I'm sorry. And that clock is telling me weird times. I'm not that late, right? Whew! I thought, man, I know I'm over time, but I'm not that over time. I just kind of lost my track of where I am. Well, Nancy remembers where I am. Bell rings. Class is dismissed. People wake up from the riveted lecture, and they go. And Peter, I think, wants to impress his buddy Jesus, right? He's had this budding, growing relationship. He's done some amazing things, and he's fallen on his face. And he has this moment, he wants to say to Jesus, yeah, but how often should we forgive? And then he does this thing, wow, be careful when you think you're going to impress your teacher. Like, should I forgive 7 times? Biblically, 7 is a full and complete number. It's a big number. Forgiving 7 times is itself hard. And Jesus is like, if you're still able to count, you're not really forgiving. Hear that again. Whatever number you make 77, and in Greek numbering, it could have been 439. Whatever it is, the point of Jesus is if you're still counting how many times you've forgiven, you didn't really forgive. That's not how it works. So, accountability. You got to root out our bad behaviors. And we have to forgive beyond memory. And I think what Jesus is doing is trying to take these 2 activities, often thought as 2 very different activities, and say that they're one. They're correctives of each other. There's no cheap grace here. You have to be authentic. You have to be real. You have to talk and do the work of family, and it's messy. And don't just toss it off or shove it under the rug. But you do that permeated by the grace and love of God. You do it pregnant with divine forgiveness that never wants to settle for less than, that never wants to leave the circle unbroken. No matter how far beyond us that is, because at the end of the day, in the messiness of what we're doing, we say always, with God's help, I will. Why does that matter to Peter? In the lens of development from here, for those of you who haven't been traveling with us, Peter that wanted nothing to do with Jesus, to hear the Peter who dies as the representative of the church Jesus started at the hands of Rome in Nero in Rome for his faith. How did Peter go from that to this? One of the things that it hits me is that it could have all ended in this moment when Jesus is denied by Peter 3 times in his moments of greatest need. Peter and Judas both betray their friend in his hour of greatest need. Judas betrays, isolates, and ends his own life. Peter betrays, returns to the community, and is there waiting when Jesus forgives him. Peter, do you love me? Feed my sheep. And the kind of thing I think that keeps Peter part of the beloved community, even when he screws up in a way that seems unrepairable, is that he knew this: I am never done working at repairing what we're doing here. Nothing you can do separates you from the love of God. Nothing you do makes you unworthy of my attention, my friendship, my unending attention. This is the word of our Lord.